Well, Muriel, thank you very, very much for a generous introduction. And ladies and gentlemen, thank all of you for a warm welcome this morning. Good morning. Greetings and good wishes from the Parliament of Canada, and especially from Justin Trudeau and our National Liberal Caucus. Thank you all for coming. Now, I'll do my very best to keep this moving right along this morning, because I presume that all of you will want to get over to the courthouse to follow the Duffy trial. I wouldn't want to keep you from that most significant exercise in government transparency. Merci à Canada 2020 de m'avoir invité aujourd'hui. Je suis très content de donner le coup d'envoi à une nouvelle série de déjeuners sur des questions économiques. J'aimerais également remercier mon collègue Muriel Bélanger, député d'Ottawa-Vanier, d'avoir passé le mot au sujet de cet événement. Merci beaucoup, Muriel. Ce matin, j'aimerais parler de croissance économique, ou plutôt du manque de croissance économique au cours de la dernière décennie. I want to talk this morning about economic growth, or the lack thereof, over the course of this past decade. My colleagues Scott Bryson, John McCallum, and Mark Garneau will be giving similar presentations across the country in Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal, and Bill Morneau in Calgary in the next number of days. Greater growth is what's needed to lift the well-being of Canada's middle class and all those who are working so very hard just to get to the middle class. It is the key to fairness. It is also key to balancing the federal books and, more importantly, keeping them balanced for any appreciable length of time. The Harper government has failed on all of these counts, and Canada needs a better economic plan. This is a good day to talk about middle-class economics. It was exactly 2 years ago today that Justin Trudeau became the leader of the Liberal Party of Canada. And no one has done more to put the middle class at the forefront of public policy. You know, but some folks just won't listen. A week ago in Toronto, Finance Minister Joe Oliver unburdened himself of a remarkably bitter speech that largely ignored middle-class realities. Now, don't get me wrong, it was good to see the minister out and about. We haven't seen much of him in Parliament. He's made it to the daily question period 5 times since last December, and befuddled by oil prices, he punted his budget into a whole new fiscal year. So people were anxious to hear what he would finally have to say last week. Sadly, he contented himself with an absurd dissertation about the history of balancing budgets. He seemed totally obsessed with the 1970s for some reason, and his memory was highly selective. He forgot the OPEC crisis of that decade. He forgot John Diefenbaker's 6 consecutive deficits a decade earlier. He forgot that only one Conservative Prime Minister in the entire 20th century, only one Conservative Prime Minister actually managed to balance a budget. His name was Robert Borden. The year was 1912, and it lasted for exactly 1 year. But more importantly, Mr. Oliver forgot that more than 2/3 of all the federal debt outstanding in Canada today can be attributed to the deficits accumulated by Brian Mulroney and Stephen Harper. Mr. Harper alone has added $4,400 in new Harper debt for every man, woman, and child in Canada. Compare that, as Mr. Oliver suggested we should, to the Liberal record. When Liberals last came to government in 1993, we inherited from Mr. Mulroney an economy that the world's financial media were saying was eligible for honorary membership in the Third World. A $40 billion annual deficit was suffocating jobs and growth. The debt ratio was 70% of GDP. Just servicing that debt was sucking up fully 1/3 of all of government revenues. The IMF was knocking at the door. Within 3 years, Liberals eliminated that deficit. We ushered in a decade of surplus budgets. We paid down debt. We slashed the debt ratio in half. We reduced taxes. We safeguarded the Canadian banking system. We secured the future of the Canada Pension Plan. We increased transfers to provinces to a record high and invested in families, Medicare, education, infrastructure, and science. 3.5 million net new jobs were created, and the economy grew at annual rates better than 3%. Fast forward from that to 2006. Mr. Harper took power and inherited a $13 billion annual surplus, probably the strongest fiscal situation in the Western world. But in less than 3 years, he put this country back on the verge of deficits once again. And that was before, I repeat this, that was before, not because of, the recession, which arrived later in the latter part of 2008. Through poor policy choices and reckless spending, while the economy was still vibrant, Mr. Harper squandered Canada's fiscal security. The recession made it worse, but it was Stephen Harper who made us vulnerable in the first place. And note this, that recession, which Mr. Harper still blames for everything, lasted only 9 months, and it ended 6 years ago. But still, Canada struggles with an economy at a low ebb. It's been Stephen Harper's diminished decade. Far from decent growth, since the Harper government came to power, Canada has had an average annual economic growth rate of only about 1.75%. That is the worst growth rate of any prime minister since R.B. Bennett in the 1930s. But rather than tackle that weakness, Mr. Harper distracts. He says, not to worry, we're still doing better than other countries. Really? Last fall, the IMF was already predicting that 139 other countries would grow faster this year than would Canada, including the US, the UK, Sweden, New Zealand, Australia, even Ireland and Greece and others. And that was before the big downturn in oil. A more recent analysis by the OECD in March of this year shows improving growth in many major economies across the Eurozone, in Germany, France, Italy, and Japan, and India, but slower growth in Canada. All of our major chartered banks have revised their Canadian growth forecasts downward. So has the Conference Board. The Governor of the Bank of Canada says the whole first quarter of this year, to use his word, is going to look atrocious. Stats Canada says our economy actually shrank in January. So the Harper government has failed to achieve meaningful economic growth. What does that mean for the middle class? Well, to start with, it means very weak job creation. The government brags about stale job numbers that are 3 and 4 and 5 years out of date. The reality of jobs growth last year was a 60% drop from 2 years earlier. Unemployment is projected to remain high. Long-term joblessness is now getting to be a particular problem. Job quality is also on the decline. The CIBC says it's at a 25-year low. Involuntary part-time work is rising. Another 28,000 full-time jobs disappeared in the latest Stats Canada report last Friday. Median after-tax Family incomes, in other words, middle-class incomes, are largely flat compared to where they were 30 years ago. Income growth has averaged just less than half a percentage point per year. So it's no wonder people don't feel that they're getting ahead. Household debt is at a record high, 165% of disposable incomes. Retail sales are down. Major stores from Target to Future Shop have closed. 3/4 of those working in the private sector don't have a company pension plan. The average 35-year-old today is able to save less than half of what their parents were able to save at their age. Among those who are now nearing retirement, fewer than 1/3 have even $100,000 put aside to sustain themselves. And another third have virtually no retirement savings at all. 2/3 of middle-class parents are worried about affording post-secondary education for their kids. In more than 40% of those empty nester households, their adult children have moved back home, or they never left, because the economy is just not good enough to let them get started on their own. And ominously, national surveys now show a majority of Canadians believe the next generation will actually be worse off than their parents. Think about that for a moment. It means the fundamental Canadian middle-class expectation of inevitable progress, of upward mobility from one generation to the next, can no longer be taken for granted. These are the fruits of too little economic growth. Mr. Harper and the elusive Joe Oliver don't seem to think that any of that really matters. They have no growth plan. Their only goal, at the expense of everything else, their only goal is to cobble together a very large tax break for a very small fraction of Canadians, most especially the wealthiest. To make financial room for that, they sell off federal assets, everything from the shares in GM to an historic tree farm in Saskatchewan. They punch a big hole of nearly $5 billion in current funding for municipal infrastructure. They cut support for the RCMP and other agencies for public safety. They claw back money that was intended for veterans. And yes, they lard on billions of dollars in new taxes, despite what they say about being tax cutters. And what is all of that in aid of? So they can impose income splitting for the wealthy. So those earning $233,000 can get the biggest tax break. This scheme is too expensive. It will cost more than $2 billion every year. It's unfair. Fewer than 15% of Canadian households can qualify. 85% will never get a penny. 85% will never get a penny. It favors those who have the most at the expense of those who have the least. It deepens inequality. It does nothing for growth, and it will not create a single new job. Canada can do so much better than that. Le Canada peut faire tellement mieux. Nous pouvons avoir un plan de croissance économique pour favoriser la prospérité, l'ambition, l'optimisme, la sécurité et la justice, surtout pour le cœur de notre économie, c'est-à-dire la classe moyenne. We can have an economic growth plan to drive greater prosperity, ambition, optimism, security, and fairness, especially at the heart of our economy, the middle class. So how do we do that? First, when resources are tight, there is no room for waste. So when this government is spending $3 billion more per year on expensive external consultants to duplicate the public service, you have to ask why. Why are the numbers of political staffers escalating? Why is the Prime Minister's office so large? And why are your hard-earned tax dollars being squandered on highly partisan tax-paid government advertising? To date, this government's advertising costs have topped $750 million. That is $750 million on advertising. Sometimes promoting things that don't even exist. How many veterans could have been helped with that amount of money? How many summer jobs for students could have been created? How many extra Mounties could have been recruited? How many food inspectors put on the job to keep Canadians safe? And yet, this profligate government has the gall to drop another $7.5 million for more ads this spring. Yes, spoiling the hockey playoffs once again, to the tune of $100,000 for every 30 seconds of airtime, to flog a budget that has been long delayed and is already discredited. It's all deeply disrespectful of taxpayers, all sheer waste. A far better way to manage the country's finances would be to invest properly and prudently in the fundamentals that drive better growth, to make our economy bigger and stronger, more competitive, more productive and prosperous. A good place to start would be transformative investments in community and public infrastructure. Think of this. Urban congestion in our major cities caused by old and limited infrastructure costs the national economy $15 billion every year. Congestion, $15 billion a year, and much of that is preventable. As fiscal hawks like David Dodge tell us, with interest rates at historic lows, now is the time to build. We can convert that short-term cost advantage into long-term capital assets. As we do so, we will create tens of thousands of good, solid, middle-class jobs while building the underpinnings of greater growth, productivity, and even better jobs in the future. The returns will flow for generations to come. Support for taking a quantum leap forward on infrastructure is virtually universal. It comes from the G20 and the IMF globally, from the Bank of Canada, the premiers, municipal governments, every major think tank, including Canada 2020, every major business and labor organization, and even the Federal Department of Finance. In their own budget plans, Finance Canada points out that investments in public infrastructure are the single most cost-effective and immediate way to promote jobs and growth, more effective than any other technique, including tax cuts. So saith the Department of Finance. But this government has chopped its flagship Building Canada Fund by a whopping 87%. Sure, they claim to have a 10-year plan, but 3/4 of the money is totally hypothetical until after 2019. And with a deliberately obscure application process, they missed almost all of last year's construction season on purpose, to avoid investing, to save the space for income splitting for the wealthy. It is so wrong-headed. Every dollar that goes into roads, water, or transit brings growth of $1.20. Every dollar into affordable housing brings growth of $1.40. $1 billion into infrastructure stimulates 16,000 person-years of good employment. And it will continue to pay dividends, because by making those investments, we will lay the foundation of a more successful, more prosperous country for years to come, one that is more resilient, both economically and environmentally. A similar argument can be made for investments in higher learning and advanced skills, our intellectual infrastructure. Right now, just over 50% of Canadians have some level of post-secondary education. That includes universities, colleges, polytechnics, apprenticeships, on-the-job upskilling, the whole gamut. About 50% have some level of PSE attainment beyond high school, and that's good. But 70% of all the new jobs of this coming decade will require skills beyond high school. Not just 50%, 70%. Urgently, we need to close that gap. The challenge is especially large for Aboriginal young people. They are the fastest growing segment of our population, and new Canadians, and children in low-income families, adults with literacy limitations, those living with disabilities, and others who have been marginalized. We need a far more inclusive workforce. That's not just a social objective, it's an economic imperative. We need a culture of lifelong learning, and that means tearing down the barriers that block the way to greater Canadian brainpower. Couple that with our capacity for scientific research, new technology, and innovation. This didn't used to be a sore point for Canada. According to the OECD, we have traditionally ranked in the top 10 countries for total investment in R&D. But sadly, not anymore. Under the Harper government, we have fallen back. Among OECD countries, the average total investment in R&D comes to about 2.4% of GDP. But Canada has dropped to 1.6% of GDP. We invested less in 2012 than in 2004. Programs and facilities have been closed, scientists have been fired and muzzled. We can and we must do better, both in government and in the private sector. And in addition to what can be achieved by applied science driven by the private sector, we need to rebuild federal support for curiosity-based pure science and discovery once again, too. It's all about brainpower, the creation and dissemination of new knowledge to maximize our utilization of the best new ideas, to be a smart economy poised for growth based on science and facts and not the prejudice of ideology. There's more to come. The ideas that I have offered this morning are just a beginning, but the point is this. When you cast off the mediocrity of this past diminished decade, when we regain our ability as Canadians to be ambitious and hopeful, when we treat each other fairly, when Canadians work together around a common vision of what we have the capacity to achieve, Canadians can accomplish great things. One thing is clear. Canada needs a new plan for the economy, one that is fairly built around the middle class and all those who are working so hard to get there. One that is focused on growth, both today and tomorrow. One that restores confidence among Canadians that their children and their grandchildren will always be able to do better than the generation that went before. Canadians are ready to embrace change. With his plan and his team, Justin Trudeau is ready to provide it. Thank you very much.
Because you did point out that the Conservative government has sold assets, it's delayed spending. It is going to present next week what it says is a balanced budget. Do you think the budget is really in balance? And if it is it going to stay in balance because of all of these sort of gimmicks that have been used to make the numbers work?
Well, we're going to have to look at that arithmetic very carefully because there is a lot of jiggery-pokery going on. It's also important to identify the measures that have some staying power and the measures that are purely transitory. When you sell an asset, for example, like whether it's the sale of the shares in GM or the tree farm in Saskatchewan or embassy property around the world and so forth, once it's gone, it's gone. You you can't resell it again. So it's not a revenue item going forward. It's a one-time top-up. We'll have to look carefully at those things. The key thing that I think a lot of Canadians will be looking for in the assumptions that go into the fiscal framework is, what is the government assuming for the price of oil for this year and then for years to come into the future? The province of Saskatchewan made some assumptions when they put their budget together 3 or 4 weeks ago. Province of Alberta did the same. It'll be interesting to see if we get from the federal government a third set of projections that will be different from the two that went before. That is going to be a key determinant of what the ongoing revenue situation will be for the government, and whether in fact it's got a solid balance or one that is based on a number of one-time transactions that will last for only a temporary period of time. I mean,
but the price of oil is my next point, because the price of oil is not going to be $100 a barrel. It may be $60 a barrel. It may be a little more higher than that. Mm-hmm. But we are really now into sort of a low oil price phase, and so much of the revenues of the federal government are determined by the price of oil. So a Liberal government is going to have to deal with an oil price that's a lot lower than it has been.
Whoever is responsible for the government of Canada and for every other government in the country that has some relation to resource revenues is going to have to cope with that reality.
And so is that likely, though, then to, and particularly when you think of some of the plans that you and others in the party are putting together, you're going to have to probably go back into deficit over the next, I don't know, medium term or short term?
Well, you know, I'm one who believes in fiscal responsibility. I've had the experience of balancing a number of budgets. That's an experience some of my Conservative friends have not had. But it's important to exercise the principles of fiscal responsibility. But what we have been able to do already, in looking at the fiscal framework insofar as it is known now, we'll get a better set of numbers next week. But insofar as the framework is known, we have been able to identify as much as $15 billion over the planning cycle of a budget that would provide flexibility for doing things differently, for making different choices. Some of that from the income splitting scheme, some of that from the waste savings that I mentioned in the course of my remarks. But we'll look at that framework and we'll make responsible decisions about how best to chart the path of the country going forward. But it will be rooted in very strong principles, as Muriel said in his introduction, of both social and economic responsibility.
But to that point, because a balanced budget has become almost sort of a holy mantra in the last, well, probably since Mr. Martin's time, but the fact is that useful investments and thoughtful investments in both infrastructure and in people, which means building infrastructure, but also education and all of the things you talked about, as long as they're not so large that they drive the debt up so much that debt servicing becomes the biggest government program, it seems to me that those can be that can be defended for a deficit budget.
Well, it gets, I think, to in a way, Don, in a bit of maybe a sideways approach, but it gets to the point of Mr. Oliver's announcement last week of balanced budget legislation. Everyone that's looked at that has rather panned the idea, as even some of the conservative gurus who appear on the television panels are saying that it's a gimmick. The point is this: when you're Minister of Finance, when you're Prime Minister, when you're running a government, you make the important decisions that are good for the country, good for the economy, good for the social objectives you want to achieve, and then you stand before Canadians with the courage to defend those decisions, and you don't hide behind an artificial piece of legislation that says, "Oh, the devil made me do it." you do what's right for the country.
And I think most Canadians now would like to find a government that's going to do that, rather than one that works on slogans and balanced budget legislation, which anyone who's ever enacted it, including Liberals in Ontario, break it the minute they, I mean, it really means nothing at all, right?
Yeah, it is
worse than the gimmick. It's worse than the gimmick.
We'll see what Mr. Oliver actually puts in his legislation. We haven't seen a bill yet. We've heard a speech, but we'll see what's actually there. But it has been ineffective in every jurisdiction where it's been tried. And it gets back to the point. It is the responsibility of government to make the best decisions for the country, for the people that they were elected to serve. And if you don't have the wisdom or the courage to stand before those people and defend those decisions and explain why they are the right decisions for the country, no gimmicky piece of legislation is a substitute for direct political accountability and responsibility.
So is it your view that the economy will be the issue on which the election turns, and will the Liberals try and make it that? Because it looks to me as the economy has been heading south, not rapidly south, but slowly south. The Conservatives have decided that security is going to be the issue, and that's the issue they want to talk about because they don't have so much to say about the economy.
Well, they have been trying to turn the page and avoid economic conversations. Look, voters will have a broad variety of things in their minds when they go to cast their ballot. It's never one single thing. But I think by and large...
But you can focus the campaign, your advertising, your speeches and so forth. Is it going to be the economy?
Our focus will be the economy, and it will specifically be the middle class and all of those who are working so very hard just to get to the middle class, and how the Government of Canada can support them, can help them to achieve their hopes and their ambitions for themselves and their families. And we will have, I think, a very credible plan that will be fully costed and explained in the platform documents for how we get to where we want to be, with a country that is growing once again, with a tax system that is fair, with investments in infrastructure and education and science, where we find that critically important intersection between the economy and the environment, and demonstrate environmental credibility once again. Those are all elements that will go together, but it will be a message that is built upon the economy and the success of middle-class Canadians.
So you would get rid of income splitting, not, I take it, for pensioners, not the
no,
let's be very... That's already in effect.
The income splitting for pensioners has been there for 4 or 5 years. It's, again, because of the way it's structured, you need to be a certain age, you need to have a certain kind of income, and you need to have a partner to split with. Mm-hmm. So it's only a fraction of seniors who can actually take advantage of this. But we've made it very clear that that's a part of the tax structure, and we will retain income splitting, pension income splitting for seniors.
But if you get rid of the proposed income splitting, that would give you another $2 billion a year by your calculation, roughly?
Yeah, a little bit more than that. It's probably 2.2, 2.3, 2.4 in that neighborhood.
Would there be other tax cuts perhaps the Liberals will propose that would be more effective for lower income people, or are you going to stay away from taxes given the rather shaky fiscal situation of the government?
Well, I have learned through long experience over 40 years in public life that you never scoop the platform prematurely. Well,
you don't have to give the exact percentages, and you don't have to give the exact income levels, but are there going to be tax cuts for lower income Canadians?
We will be
in principle, if not in specific.
We will be seeking tax fairness, and as we've said, our focus is on the middle class and those who are working so hard to get there.
Now, give us a... So give us Central Canadians here a little report from your part of the country. You and I have been friends, longer than I can actually remember, but I've always sort of felt that you should be
What part of it have you blotted out of your mind? The part where you were in Regina.
Well, that for sure. No, I've always been kind of concerned about you because being a Liberal in Saskatchewan, I think if you weren't covered by the Endangered Species Act, I probably wouldn't know you at all. But the gerrymandering of the Saskatchewan ridings has been re-gerrymandered again, and if people are not aware, in central Canada, in Saskatchewan, in the cities of Regina and Saskatoon, the ridings have all been partly urban and then gone out into the countryside, and they'd be called urban ridings, but they go out into the countryside so that the Conservative votes in the country can overwhelm the Liberal and NDP votes in the city. This has now been changed, and you're going to have real urban ridings. Is this going to give the Liberal Party more of a chance, or is it an NDP chance? What are the changes going to be?
Well, I think that change more fairly and more accurately represents the current reality in Saskatchewan. Under the old electoral map of the 14 ridings in Saskatchewan, even though we have two large and growing cities, Regina and Saskatoon, Saskatoon I think at 250,000 and Regina over 200,000, there was not one single urban riding. They were all these combinations. And a lot of people in urban centers felt that they were diluted in their voter impact. So that was corrected by the most recent Electoral Boundaries Commission, and a commission composed of eminent Saskatchewan people, and they made this judgment, and I think it produces a more accurate reflection of the political reality in the province. It will make 4 or 5 of those new ridings intensely competitive. And I think Liberals have an opportunity to win several of them. But it still boils down to the effective presentation of your case. A redistribution produces a set of boundaries that all political parties have to work with. The winners will be the ones that provide the leadership, that provide the platform, that provide the candidates, and work the hardest to earn the trust and respect of voters. It's not good enough just to assume you have the right to govern. You have to go out there and convince voters that you deserve their trust. And once you've got it, you've got to respect it.
And does the election campaign really start? With the budget next week? Is this?
I have the feeling it's already underway. That's one of the things about.
No, but now we're seeing you. You know, now suddenly the Liberals are energized, or seem to be energized. Bill's going out somewhere in Calgary, and Scott's in Toronto, and so forth. And I mean, it looks like you're campaigning to me.
Have you missed my other meetings? Well, you know, I think this is the reality of fixed election date legislation. It'll be interesting to see if we actually this year follow the fixed election date law. That would be the first time in 3 elections that the law was actually followed. But when you have that date, even though it's 6 months into the future, it's not that the campaign under the law starts 37 days before election day. It starts months and months before. Yeah. So in effect, the campaign has been ongoing now.
And the House won't be back once it's gone in June. So.
I wouldn't expect to see it back after it adjourns in June.
Yeah. Well, it's nice to see you this morning. Thank you for getting up early and coming to talk to us.
Thank you to Canada 2020.
And good luck to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.